Anita, for the end, do we want to do a photo? Yeah.
Yes, please, everyone stay with us to the end if you want to be in the photo. And I encourage folks to turn their cameras on for the picture at the end. And Audrey, I did burn a fire for you. I just didn't get to keep it lit because we were doing too much today, but just know that the energy is out in the universe, honoring you and your presence and your fierceness. So thank you.
Should we go ahead and get started, Anita? I know that people will probably be joining us, but
yes,
we definitely want to give Audrey enough time. So
let's do it.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. Bienvenidos. We are glad to have everybody here with us. We're excited to be hosting the amazing Audrey Silvestre, who will be sharing with us about her amazing work here in Los Angeles. She'll be sharing with us her chapter, Vestí de Reina, from the book We Are Not Dreamers. We're excited to hear about this and also to hear about her current research of her dissertation project. And so before we begin, before we hear from Audrey and begin an amazing Platica, I would like to do a land acknowledgement to get us going. So with great respect, the Department Chicana, Chicano, Latina, Latino Studies here at Cal State LA acknowledges the Tongva people as the traditional caretakers of the Tongva the Tongva world, which includes the Los Angeles Basin, South Channel Islands, San Gabriel, and Pomona Valleys, and portions of Orange County, San Bernardino, and Riverside counties. Cal State LA is located within these lands, and as an institution located on unceded Tongva land, we pay our respects to our ancestors, our elders, and our relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging. Consistent with our values of building community, we recognize the importance and responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native people. I also would like to do another type of acknowledgement. I would also like to take this time to honor the resiliency and the activism of our trans and gender nonconforming siblings and communities. I want to take this time to recognize that we stand on their shoulders, this generation of struggle, activism, and courage that have brought us so many freedoms to us, our community. The trailblazing work from Silvia Rivera to our sister Soraya Reyes has provided many to live openly, authentically, and to, for some, undocumented, unafraid, and unashamed. By offering this acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold Cal State LA more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous people. And we affirm that our trans and gender nonconforming siblings make our communities vibrant and stronger. Aho, to all my relations. I'll pass it to you, Anita, so you can share a little bit about the work we've been doing this semester.
Gracias, colega amigo Rafa. Thank you for that powerful and beautiful both land and community acknowledgement, both to our ancestors, our transcestors, our guides and mentors in the road to healing and taking care of our community. Is powerful and beautiful. Thank you so much. I want to acknowledge that, you know, that community acknowledgement is part of our vision around these pláticas that we have had. So in the fall, Profe Solórzano and Profe Danny Topete have partnered with me and others to bring you all these beautiful pláticas where we're intentionally centering the voices of Afro-Latinx people, of queer and trans folks, of immigrant, trans and queer immigrant voices, etc. People who have been marginalized and minoritized even in our own communities. And so we're really excited that that Audrey Silvestre is rounding out this beautiful Platica series. We first had Frank Ayate, then we had Eddie Alvarez, and now we're ending with this fierce mujerista that I love and I'm part of community with. So we're really excited. We also want to thank our partners. Well, first, our department, the Chicano, Latino Studies Department, and then also the Women, Gender, Sexuality Studies Department at Cal State LA, the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality at Cal State LA. And we want to remind folks that we have just some Zoom guidelines. We want to stay muted when you join. We want to be aware of your video and audio settings. Raise your hand in the chat to be called, or put question and answers into the Q&A. You can also include a stack so that we can call you. We encourage you to use your Zoom reactions, your emojis, your claps. So we want to see love signs. We want to see excitement, and also encouragement in the chat as much as you would like to share. Let's enjoy our time together and listen to our beautiful colega, Audrey Silvestre. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anita. And I guess without further ado, let's get this show going. And I have the honor to introduce everybody, Audrey Silvestre. I have the honor to introduce my sister, Audrey Silvestre, who is currently a PhD candidate in the Department of Chicana and Chicano and Central American Studies at UCLA. She mentioned this earlier. She is proud that she earned her BA in Gender Sexuality Studies at Cal State Long Beach and her master's from Cal State Northridge in Chicana and Chicano Studies. As a doctoral student, she explores the discourses of citizenship, nation, and value by looking at the intersections of gender, race, and sexuality to further understand how these identities inform immigration reform and activism. Her scholarship draws from women of color feminism and queer of color critique, criminalization, and the prison industrial complex, state violence and institutional violence, sexualized violence, reproductive violence, and other gender-based violence. Also, I'm proud to say that I've worked with Audrey before in the past. In the past, we worked together on an animation video that discusses Ansaldua's conocimiento as it relates to unframing toxic masculinities. Many of you have read her essay, Me Vestí de Reina, which was published in the We Are Not Dreamers book, a groundbreaking textbook that centers undocumented scholars who theorize about undocumented life here in the United States. Taking up first Ansaldúa and then Galarte's words, she reminds us the importance to listen to what our Joteria is saying, to listen to what our trans and gender non-conforming community is telling us. She states, and also I asked her if it was okay for me to share this with all of you, but she states, for all you graduating seniors, she says, you can do it, keep your back into it. And so please join me in welcoming my femtor, my sister, and your guest speaker, Audrey Silvestre. Show her some love.
Thank you, Rafa. Super sweet of you. Well, first I want to say thank you to everyone for being here, and thank you, Anita and Rafa, for inviting me into the department. It's Chicana, Chicano, and Latino Studies, correct? So before I guess we started, I mentioned that I always enjoy kind of doing these talks with Cal States because I went there, and I feel like that's where I usually have like the best kind of like conversations. And it just feels a lot less, institutional or hierarchical, where other schools are like, tell us what we can do to make the school better, and it's, I'm not super interested in doing that. But anyways, so I also love Cal State LA. It's close to where I grew up. I grew up in Southeast LA, specifically in Huntington Park and later Bell Gardens. So I think it's like a lot of people that I grew up with sort of went to school there. So I feel like it's kind of like a sister school. So I guess just kind of like a little bit of an agenda, I guess, for people that need that type of support. I do. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the essay, and then I'll talk about a publication and my dissertation that I'm working on, and then talk about digital archives to sort of, kind of let y'all know where we're going. Okay, I'm going to start, and I'm going to share screen, and this always feels like I'm stumbling through. So give me a second. Okay, cool. I think I got it. Okay, so my essay in the Vestí de Reina Trans and Queer Sonic Spatial Entitlement centers the resilience of trans and queer undocumented people. So in this essay, I merged the scholarship of Dr. Gay Teresa Johnson and Dr. Francisco Galarte. And so I primarily argue that by centering undocumented trans women in the analysis of immigrant rights, we're forced to reckon with the limitations of a heteronormative and often gender binary discourse. So I use the concept of Dr. Johnson's of sonic spatial entitlement. And so she talks about it, how, you know, it's thinking about entitlement to situate themselves within particular spatial histories, and when they express a spatial claim to change the stakes of an existing space and to remake the meaning in relation to themselves and their community. So she's talking about this in relation to people who take up space and kind of use sound to do this sort of sonic spatial entitlement. And so for me, like, it reminds me of the power that sound has to create community. And also, like, when we think of protests, sound often, you know, like we hear the chants, right? That's like something that's like happening. And that expresses like our dissatisfaction with things. But I think like, I also think of like, particularly at protests, like the queer contingent, there's always, you know, chistes, and there's always kind of gossiping, and, you know, there's also this other sort of sound that comes up for me. And I think that also is important because it creates community and disrupts the sort of anger that brings us together to protest. And so I think, you know, that's important to think about because it really brings up, you know, joy and kind of like community in that sense. So I merge Johnson's work with the work of Galarte. And so as Rafa mentioned, you know, he makes this call for Joteria to listen to what your trans brothers and sisters are saying, and remember those who are long forgotten. And so Galarte's work is like super important to me because he's really merging transgender studies, Chicana studies, Latinx studies, and queer studies. And his call is important because it really forces us again to kind of push against the cisgender sonics that cloud queer movements, including undocumented spaces. So the call to listen and centering sound as an important sensorial register really points to the importance of listening with intentionality, in particular to those who are often silenced or marginalized. So again, what resonates with me, and also the work of Lisa Gacho, who I cite in the essay, is kind of this provocation to reckon with our own failures. And so how does this reckoning, you know, also inform and transform like the field of like Chicana and Chicano studies? And I sort of like emphasize the A and the O because there's a lot that still needs to be done to sort of push these sort of like trans narratives and not just narratives, but like theories and analyses and modes of seeing that are still marginal within the field. And so just a little bit kind of, I wanted to talk a little bit of like how I came to write this piece, because I think that's important for, you know, to like, you all just get to see the final result, but it was a process. So the chapter was developed for my MA thesis at UCLA. And so when I was an undergrad, I knew I wanted to research and write about queer and trans undocumented kind of like movements or histories. And at the time, I graduated 2010, so, you know, just to put a little context, at the time, you know, the stories that were super kind of like circulated were like the stories of the high achieving student, or like the student activist and the dreamers, and you know, who were really bringing attention to the passing of the Dream Act, which didn't happen. And so this work is important, was and is important. But I felt like there's like a lot, there was so much more going on, you know, like that just felt so, that was just, you know, like just, you know, we're just scratching at the surface. So, but what really kind of like solidified this specific chapter that you all read was I attended a civil disobedience, the one that I mentioned in the essay, and then I took a course with Dr. Johnson, who wrote the book that I referenced. And so when I attended the civil disobedience, it was really like important, or I mean, I went because my friend was like, come with me, and I was like, sure, you know, like I'm down to support. And because we were driving from UCLA to Orange County, so it's a commitment. So I went, and, you know, I didn't think much about it, but I hadn't been back to Orange County since Soraya Reyes, who had passed away. And so Soraya Reyes was a trans undocumented activist and organizer who unfortunately passed away on June 12, 2014. So when the song Todos Me Miran by Gloria Trevi played at the Civil Disobedience, I was reminded of Soraya and her vigil. And so in the essay, I sort of analyzed this civil disobedience alongside with the memory and impact that Soraya had. And her impact is not only in Orange County, but also the larger undocumented movement. And then like taking the course with Dr. Johnson forced me to kind of sit with the text and think like, okay, how are these things related? And sort of like, this is kind of where the idea for the chapter came up. So again, I think like sitting with that kind of like really forced me to like, you know, again, reckon with like the limitations of like a heteronormative and gender binary discourse that, you know, is dominant in the movement and the literature, although that's changing a little bit thanks to some of these Rafa, the book that you're a part of. And then something that I also wanted to share was like, I'm often asked like, what was the writing process, you know, for me in writing the piece Vestí de Reina. And I was the writing it for the book. I had already written part of it for the MA. So I had the support of Dr. Alicia Vega and Dr. Genevieve Gonzalez in the process of kind of like walking me through sort of like, okay, this is how you respond to an editor, you know, these things that I'm learning how to do still, right? But writing my MA, like, to be honest, and I was going to put a slide of like, I don't know, somebody crying, because when I was writing this, like I would cry as I was revisiting kind of like the details of Zoraya's life and her death. And so it was really heavy to write. And you know, the editing process for the book was like similar, like it was a struggle. And I think the thing that kind of like sort of pushed me to push myself forward and continue with it was that I wanted to share Soraya's story and her legacy, and like you know, not that my chapter does any justice to who she was and what she contributed, but I really wanted that story to be told. And also I trusted the vision that both Lacey and Genevieve had in editing the book. And then after I completed my research, my MA, to be honest, like I was like, I don't want to write about this anymore. Like, I don't know what my dissertation is going to be. And I sort of had this like crisis because it was so difficult and emotionally draining to write. And I was thinking like, this isn't sustainable. So I really like wrestled with like, sort of feeling obligated to carry this research because it feels so urgent, especially with the last president. And I mean, still now, right? Like there's so many things that, you know, are dangling, right, that are being dangled. So I wrestled with that because it feels urgent, and I was like, okay, I need to like follow through and do this. And I felt kind of like I was abandoning like, you know, my community in a sense. But I also knew that like it wasn't sustainable. And ultimately I felt like I decided to switch my focus because I just needed to do something that I was going to be able to carry through. Like, to be honest, I don't know if I would be able to write a dissertation on something like this. And so I just like share that because I feel like it's important to also talk about the difficulties in like writing something so heavy like this. And so I kind of want to move on to talk a little bit about Soraya. So I first met Soraya when I was an undergraduate through the organization De Colores Queer Orange County, which was an organization, community organization that brought visibility for queer and trans and Latinx in Orange County. And so as an undergrad, I was involved in organizing, and I would attend fundraisers, and, you know, we would invite them to speak at our campus, and, you know, that sort of kind of relationship was built. And so when I first met Soraya, she stood out because she had this like contagious laughter and just exuded joy. She was fearless and unapologetic. And I think like she also, for me at the time, like I just saw her as like she had so much energy, you know. And thinking about her, I see how she unraveled the narrative of respectability politics that surrounded the immigrant rights movement at the time. So again, this is 2010. So things that were happening around the time was like the Undocumented and Unafraid coming out of the Shadows campaign. This was kind of like taking off, where people were like doing these public outings. And then, but also simultaneously, or like a little bit before that, you know, at these spaces, people were asked not to share their queer identities. So there was kind of like these things that were like, you know, kind of conflicting that was happening. And so, you know, we can, you know, like fast forward 12 years later, we can kind of 11 years later, we can sort of sit here and think of like, okay, the critiques, right, of like the movement. But at the time, we have to think about the goal was harm reduction, and harm reduction was through the passing of the DREAM Act, and these were strategies that were needed at the time. So to share a little bit more about Zoraida, she was born in Michoacan, Mexico. She was admitted to UC Santa Barbara and majored in gender studies, but unfortunately had to drop out because at the time, resources for undocumented students were even much more scarce. And although Amendment Bill 540, which made it possible for undocumented students to pay in-state tuition, had passed, many still struggle to pay tuition. And many of my friends would have parties to do cooperacha, to help them help make those payments. So after Zoraida dropped out, she returned to Santa Ana and enrolled in community college. She worked at a fast food restaurant. And I think of her dropping out in how it points to the lack of structural support that she needed and didn't have access to as both trans women and undocumented, but also like first gen working class, right? And so I think of like all the dreams and aspirations that she was unable to reach. I think about how different her life would have been if she had the support she needed. And I also think again about like, how did we fail her and how do we fail other trans women? And so I always, say like, she should be here telling her story. She should be telling you about her research, And so I want to share a quote by one of her friends, Jose Olmos, who's, who knew about this and couldn't make it. So he was like, he wanted me to share this. And so he said, "The joy that shined through her person when she danced through the streets of Santa Ana, either running errands or being late somewhere, as she was notorious for, was contagious, and you couldn't help but smile and want to dance as well. Her courage to live her true life is the lesson and gift she had in my life. There was something about her that you just wanted to welcome her in and wanted to take care of her. She was fragile, so innocent in every form. She was my sister." Ooh. "And she's my guide, and she's with me forever." So, in fact, this I wouldn't cry, and of course, it's okay. So I dedicate this chapter to her and her memory as a trans undocumented activist who paved the way for so many of us. So I'm gonna invite us all to take a breath, a moment to just breathe. Okay, so I'm gonna switch gears a little bit and sort of move to my dissertation and kind of the projects that I'm currently working on. So let's see, let me switch the slide. Oh, also check out Familia Trans Queer Liberation Movement. This is their website. They honor Zoraida and they cite her as one of the co-founders for the organization. And there's ways to give them money, be involved, sign petitions that they have. Okay, so switching gears completely, or sort of. So I'm currently working on a piece that I'm working to publish, and it's called Trapped for Life, Trans Femme Aggressive Suspensions of Violence in Hardcore Punk. So in this piece, I center Drew Ariela Sands, the lead singer of the punk band Trap Girl. And you can see them with their beehives right over here. So I focus on how she calls attention to the exacerbated transphobic and homophobic violence experienced by the trans and queer community. And so I'm working through this idea that I'm calling trans femme aggressive sensibilities. So it's an embracement both of softness and fierceness that go against the rigid boundaries usually upheld in hardcore punk. And through this enactment of a trans femme aggressive sensibility, the music in Trap Girl momentarily suspends violence experienced by trans, queers, and women while calling for the removal of those who perpetrate such violence. So on this trans, I gotta work on the wording because I'm even getting stuck on it, but this trans femme aggressive sensibility also allows us to trace musical influences of Trap Girl that reveal a genealogy of women and queer musicians, sounds, lyrics, and visuals, and really centering like a feminine approach and a femme approach to hardcore punk. So really thinking about like feminist and hardcore punk and kind of like the dichotomy of like softness and hardness and Drew's fierceness. And so I'm, just kind of trying to go through these, not to spend too much time, because I want to have time for Q&A. So my dissertation, this is what I'm sort of writing right now. I'm trying to working through. It's constellations of abject communities, brown, queer, and feminist punk in Los Angeles. So my dissertation primarily looks at cultural productions and abject punk placemaking that's created through this idea of like feeling excluded. And I center Southeast LA, but I also talk about like South Central and East LA. And so I'm trying to pay attention to how spatial, affective, and sonic practices inform the process and production of placemaking. So are you like, basically I'm trying to think like, how do people who identify as punk and queer and feminist in Southeast LA who feel like they don't belong, how are they creating community and kind of like pushing against this sort of like, idea that if you're queer, you have to move to WeHo, just kind of like how are we gay in Southeast LA, so that's sort of what I'm trying to think about. And also like I'm focusing on Southeast LA because I grew up there, as I mentioned earlier, and like what I heard about there growing up was kind of like nothing good in, like the media. And so I wasn't necessarily super proud of where I came from. And I felt like nobody else there was gay. Of course it was gay people, but I didn't know of them. So this really kind of like prompted me to think of like both queer and feminist people from Southeast LA. And as I begun to interview people, like there's always like that Thea or that cousin or that older sister that, we're super into metal or we're super into goth, and kind of introduce like the people who I'm interviewing into punk. So I'm also thinking of like, those sort of like stories. And so I'm looking at 3 case studies, and so I'm looking at punk like DIY festivals that specifically center queer and feminism. So for instance, Scutterfest, there's Clitfest and Ladyfest. And I'm trying to think about them kind of like post 9/11, and also thinking about the economic crisis like of 2008. And so kind of like how do they inform these sort of like spaces? And again, so how do people develop a sense of belonging? And this flyer, the Scutterfest flyer, so this is the first time I'm showing it anywhere because this is from one of the archives that I digitized. And I haven't seen it anywhere. So just wanted to share that before we move on. Okay. So the other case study I'm looking at is Chiquex Roquerex. So it's a Southeast LA rock camp for girls, gender expansive youth, and LGBTQ youth. And so through this, I'm thinking of kind of like, again, placemaking, and I'm also thinking about like the decorations. If you can see the picture, like the piñatas and that stuff dangling, like this was all made by some of the organizers. And so I'm trying to think of like, how does fem labor disrupt institutions such as a school setting, and also thinking about gender and sound, because it's like, like in school, it's like you have to be like quiet, clarita, te ves más bonita, whereas like at camp, it's kind of like scream, growl. So that's one of them. And then I'm also looking at Club Scum. So it's not happening anymore, kind of because of COVID and these other stuff that happened. But it was a monthly queer nightclub at Club Chico in Montebello, which is also like such an important space to remember. And so I'm trying to think about kind of like brown queer sonics in this, and thinking of like how like there's like a punk song merged with like a cumbia or like a merengue. It's sort of like, how do these like sort of incongruent sounds work to produce this kind of like queer brown sound. So just to talk a little bit about how I do what I do. So I'm doing like a sonic and visual analysis of performance and ephemera. So like flyers, pictures, even like videos on Instagram or stuff like that. And so I'm doing autoethnographic work, and that's because I'm involved in some of these spaces. And I'm also doing oral histories. And I'm creating a digital archive. And so in 2019, in December 2019, I began digitizing the digital archive of Rudy Garcia. And let me show you who he is. Okay, so this is Rudy Garcia right here with the remorseless shirt. And so Rudy at the time was looking for someone to help him organize his stuff. And I was trying to interview him. So it kind of worked out because I was like, okay, I'll help you with this. And so, you know, kind of like building reciprocity and community. I've been helping him by digitizing his stuff and like doing interviews, which I have like over 20 hours of his life. And so Rudy Garcia is a queer punk Chicano who has curated and organized queer and punk events in LA for over 20 years. So Club Scum and the Maricon Collective are sort of part of like the most recent ones. And when I first met Rudy, he kind of interviewed me and he was like, well, you know, who are you? What are you? You know? And so we had this conversation. And so he just told me that he wanted to organize his papers because he was really just trying to get his life organized. And, you know, he has like so much, he has a lot of stuff. Like I've digitized over 2,000 stuff of his and we're not done. And so I asked him, you know, because like nerd and thinking about the archive, I was like, so what are you going to do with your things? And then he was like, well, he's like, nothing. He's like, this is just for me to have organized. And he said that he didn't want to give it to an archive because I was like, well, why don't you donate it? You know, and you know, he has apprehensions. You know, archives are racist, you know, all these things. So he doesn't want to just kind of like give it away without knowing it's going to be taken care of. And I think that's like really important and really real to have distrust of institutions. I totally support it. But then I think for me, I was thinking of like, so what does it mean to catalog an archive that has no institutional future? You know, like if he gives it to family, like it's going to be all like disrupted. So like that part of me gives me anxiety, but I'm trying to sit with that anxiety and be okay with it. So this is one of the flyers for Club Scum, and then that's Rudy and Maricon Collective. And then the other person who I've been working with is Myra Aguilar. So Myra grew up in Huntington Park and she currently lives in Southgate. And she has also organized in Southeast LA and LA for over 20 years. She's been involved with the Ovarian Cycles. She was one of the co-founders of Chicas Roqueras. And most recently, she's been involved with Skate Cellas. Look them up on Instagram. And so in contrast to Rudy, she wants to create a website to kind of like, you know, to make these flyers accessible to anybody, you know, who has some connection with them, but also, again, nerd me, I'm like, great, this, you know, for scholars, you know, who have access to it. So I'm kind of working with these two, with Myra and Rudy to kind of digitize our archives and sort of, you know, organize them and, you know, they're each going to do what they want with it. But I think for me, sort of like I think my research interest in it and working with these archives is like to highlight voices and stories and also performances of like and sounds of those that are like on the periphery. And I don't like, I'm not just like trying to be like, oh, you know, women were here too, queers were here too. Like, you know, that I think that's going to happen eventually, like in my work. But like my larger goal is to like interrogate kind of like gender, race, class, immigration status, like questions of valuement and devaluement, also like femininity and feminist. And I think like these archives will help me tell these stories. And but again, like my end goal is like, I don't just want to be like, oh, I want to add this sort of, you know, history, like we were here too. I think it's like, how do we talk about that? But also again, kind of like question things. And again, circling back to Frank, how do these Galartes work? So how do these kind of like push the boundaries of like the disciplines of Chicano studies and Latinx studies? And yeah, that's it. So thank you, y'all.
Yay.
Bravo, yes. Please join me in congratulating Audrey for an amazing presentation. Show her some love. Gracias.
Yes, thank you.
And now what I'll do is I'll hand it over to you, Anita, if you could lead us in facilitating the Q&A.
Gracias, Rafa, y gracias, Audrey. That was wonderful. It was like going on a journey with you, and I appreciate your vulnerability and your limited apology for the vulnerability, because we know we need to just like be in our feelings and in our passion. So thank you for that reminder. I love how your passion is guiding all of your work. That's powerful. we want to open up the space for resonance, reflection, and questions. We would love for you to drop either your name and say like stack in the Q&A and or the actual question, but we also want to try to encourage the students to ask the questions, you know, first, I guess, because we want to make sure that they get this opportunity since they don't have that much opportunity to talk to our colegas, and this might be their one and only time unless they push themselves to reach out to Audrey. So thank you everybody for, please put in your questions, and of course we'll go to you, our colegas from across the country, but students, please raise your hand either as participants or stack into the chat. And maybe we can even call on some of our students. Don't be scared. In our chat, I just want to read really quickly. It says, thank you, Audrey. That was great. From Elizabeth Lopez. I remember a presentation from 2019, Megan Amaral and Idalia saying, gracias, Audrey. Your work is so amazing and honest. From Idalia Robles de Leon. Thank you, colegas, for being here. All right. ¿Quién está listo? Lista, liste, listex. Okay, Jose, yay. Jose Leanos, please feel free to ask your question.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Audrey. I had a question. So in reading your paper, it made me really question about the whole humanizing aspect of how you mentioned, African-American, the slavery kind of, and, us queer people of color and marginalized populations being less than human. So like my question was, what would it look like if we could be human, what are the steps towards that? Or should we disregard that and disregard this patriarchal idea of humanity and create our own term, on our own rules and everything and shape it how we want? Sorry. Yeah, that's my question.
Thank you, Jose, asking the hard questions. I think, I think doing away with kind of like these labels or kind of like, these groups that are made, right? Like human, like who came up with that and like why, like questioning that. And I think it's also kind of like thinking a little bit more about like, I always think back to like the Combahee River Collective and like their piece on kind of like, if you center like Black women, you kind of like everybody else by default will sort of like, benefit. So I feel like let's focus on that maybe a little bit more and like less on kind of like, am I human or like, or do you see me as human? But it's kind of like, within ourselves and our communities, kind of like, how do we organize ourselves and work against, sort of like also these things that like are, passed on to us in our communities, like anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity, like even anti-immigrant sentiments, of course, homophobic and transphobic kind of like sentiments that are said to each other. So it's kind of like working within ourselves, but I think really starting from kind of like, again, like I would say, what the Combahee River kind of talks about and kind of, centering those who are most affected. So I don't know, also like, when I was writing that piece, I was kind of like asked to sort of engage that. And I think I would have written a different piece now, because I really don't think that I need to spend my time necessarily kind of like trying to convince people that like we're human. And some people feel like that's a strategy, but that's not mine necessarily. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Gracias, Audrey. Any other students who want to ask questions? Jorge Leal says, Audrey, it's always great and enriching to learn more about your work, and now you're just in progress. Looking forward to seeing the archives. Yes, we're excited. We even want to see your drafts in progress because we want to learn more. We learned so much from you. Yay, Wanda. So opening it up to anybody who would like to ask questions, please ask your question, Wanda.
Hi, Anita, Audrey. How wonderful to hear your your work. It's just, I just have to say, it looks like a tremendous project. It is huge. I'm just imagining the data. It's really exciting. You know what I'm going to ask you. I think you know. As someone who spends a lot of her free time, curating themed mixtapes or playlists. I have a couple. There's one that I call Queer Angst, and then there's another one that I call, that reminds me so much of I don't know, circus disco, kind of like queer brown spaces, from a certain time, right? And so I would love to hear you say a little bit about your idea for brown queer sonics, and anything like how you came upon it. I know it's all a process, and yeah, I'd love to hear you elaborate a little bit on that.
Yes, I just want to say first, Jorge runs the Rock Archivo Instagram page. And so his work was a great sort of inspiration. So just to connect worlds, Jorge knows Myra, who I'm working with on the archive. So it's kind of like this small world of like, punk, and Rock en Español kind of like group of people. But to answer your question, Wanda, so I'm still developing like that chapter, but I started thinking about it sort of through, there's this performance, and I think, who is it? I think Megan might remember this because I presented a little bit about this in Rafa's class before. So there was a drag queen named Barbara Wire, and so there, Scum had a kind of like Miss Scum sort of like contest, in that performance, they sort of do like this mix of kind of like, they start with, I think it's like Brown Cow Stunning by Winnie Exchange. Oh, no, Vicente knows this. But Nikki Hart, yeah, so Brown Cow Stunning, and then it goes into Doja Cat, who has that song about being a cow, and then it goes to the song Mula Vaca. So that's sort of like triggered kind of like thinking about those kind of like mergings of songs. And I guess like something I'm thinking about is like, is it only possible in these square spaces, or kind of like, I think for me, I kind of see like Club Scum as like kind of starting this like sort of trend that then kind of like took off, where like there's more other clubs that are sort of doing this kind of like punk goth or alternative kind of like mixture with like cultural stuff. And not saying that that maybe hasn't happened before, but it's like particular to like, this sort of like moment. And so I'm trying to think of two kind of like how, or like, what is it that kind of like made those, things happen. And as I've interviewed Rudy, he talked about, having all these like different punk sort of like queer punk spaces like Scutterfest. But something about like this moment that made him feel more comfortable to do Scum in this specific way. So while there were other iterations and kind of sort of led to this moment, I think that there's like something there that really made him feel comfortable, and he hasn't figured that out for himself. And I'm trying to figure out like, what was it culturally that shifted, or, thinking about it in that way. So I'm still thinking about it, but that's sort of kind of a little bit of like process behind it.
Yeah, thank you, Audrey. Yeah, there's so much there. I would say yes. I think spatiality, space matters. Space does change how we listen and what we're able to listen, like in what ways we're able to listen. So yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for these insights.
Yeah, and I think because it's at Club Chico also kind of allows for that, to just add, which Club Chico is a gay bar in East LA, well, Montebello, arguably East LA.
Gracias for that question, Wanda. And if you have anything you'd like to share in the chat for us to like continue doing our research, because I know you have worked on so much of this work as well, we welcome it. Rafa said, where do we get that circus mixtape? He wants it. And he's got the next question.
Audrey, thank you so much for, giving us that gift of that chapter that really centers joy, and specifically during this protest, right? This protest to shut down to cancel the contract between ICE and Santa Ana Police Department jail. And I just want to let people know that where does that stand? They did successfully a few years later in 2017, specifically immigrant rights activists, specifically trans migrant Latinas, literally were jamming packed that city council, and they successfully ended the contract between ICE and Santa Ana Police Department. So that's some straight up joy right there. And I mention this because when we're reading Frank's book, Brown Transfigurations, I'm not going to name the particular student, but one student had shared how it's important for us to center also joyous lives and the importance of bringing that into talking about these narratives, right? And I want to know if you could just speak a little bit about that process, the importance of documenting the dancing, the music, the songs, the Beyonce that took place in front of Santa Ana Police Jail, and how that is part of documenting trans lives.
Yeah, I think also like thinking about time, this was like around 2014 when there was like a lot of, or I guess much more attention was given to kind of like trans women, particularly Black and women of color, trans women of color who were being murdered at the time. So I think that there was like, it just felt heavy, you know, and I didn't want to write something that like the piece was already heavy because I was engaging with Soraya and her own death. And so I was kind of like, how do we also think of kind of like these moments again of like joy, or just kind of like we're more than that, you know, we're more than like just like numbers, right? Like either dead or alive, like we're either like, you know, I don't know, like una carga or, you know, we're dead, you know, like it's kind of these like two things. And so kind of like, how do we sit in the in between? And also like, I think for me is like trying to pay attention to like things that aren't like necessarily like centered. So like the action got a lot of actually like news coverage because people were arrested, and you know La Reina del Slan, you know, she came from San Francisco and had this like amazing like kind of, you know, get up and this like giant banner, and that was like really important. But I think for me kind of like again this sort of like aftermath of like the kind of waiting for people to be released, that was really like, again, you know how I said like in the there's like the chance, but then there's like the chisme and the hangout part. And I think for me that's like was the generative part, that like that's where we joke around with each other, that's where, you know, we are shady with each other, you know, that's where we make plans like, okay, where are we gonna go eat, where are we gonna go, you know, have drinks, right? So I think for me it's kind of like these more like spaces that aren't necessarily like the center of the attention, and kind of like how do we turn to those and kind of think of things that are a little bit like, that's where the fun is at, you know, like you go to a protest, like yes you go, but then it's like you're up with your friends, you're like, what are we gonna do next, you know? And so for me like that was sort of that, and just like the impromptu-ness of it, it was just kind of like everybody was bored, like, you know, energy was going down, and it's kind of like, how do we bring it back energy? And that was one of like the response was kind of like, okay, let's just plug in this music and like let's just start dancing. And you know, the steps of like the police department sort of turned into this impromptu sort of kind of like, you know, a little like catwalk, you know, where people were sort of catwalking and doing their bailes, you know. So I think that's really important too.
Yes, I just was sharing that it reminds me of going to Latin Pride marches when I was in the late 90s and early 2000s at UCLA, and you know, people like Stacy Macias and Claudia, like they were the ones who organized us to go, but we were like critiquing the Latin Pride people the whole time for calling it Latin Pride, for, you know, collaborating with organizations that we weren't politically aligned with. But again, it was a space for us to like do, you know, to build community, to grow awareness and to show solidarity. And I remember one protesta, it was one of my favorites. We were really tired and hungry, and we were, me and the Raza women were saying, ¿Qué queremos? And the elote person was passing by, and we're like, elotes, ¿cuándo? Ahorita, you know. So it's just, again, like people don't really think about, and I think LA is prime for, LA and LA area is prime for looking at the complex layering of the way protest takes place. So thank you for that reflection. I deeply resonate with it. Any other questions or comments for for Audrey.
Hi, Audrey. Oh, I think somebody else was going to go. I'll go after.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So I have Megan, and then is it Rita that was talking right now?
Yes,
Okay,
but
so
I'll wait. I'll wait.
Okay, so Megan Amaral and then Rita.
This was just more of a comment because I know writing about trans violence that was going on now and like in the past, I feel like the archive is so traumatic, and it's refreshing and it's beautiful and nice to see joyous spaces being written about. So that was just it.
Thank you, Megan. That's so sweet.
Yes, thank you, Megan. Go ahead, Rita.
Thank you. I'm Rita Urquijo Ruiz over here all the way from San Antonio, Texas. Happy to join you, Audrey, tonight. And thank you, Anita and Rafa, for making this available on, to open enough for someone like me to join you on an afternoon after a long day of teaching. I just couldn't wait to get to you because Audrey, as you can remember, anytime that the Joteria hangs out, we're gonna make desmadre, right? And so I think that I have this phrase that is kind of like close to Senator John Lewis's phrase. We must get to do good trouble, to get into good trouble, right? But my phrase is escándalo con propósito, hacer escándalo con propósito. So scandal with a purpose, and the idea of wherever we are, vamos a hacer escándalo, sometimes con propósito and sometimes sin propósito, right? It's the idea of celebrating life and celebrating joy. And so Audrey, more than anything, I just want to thank you for the work that you are putting out there and producing, and to offer anything that I can help you with. If you want to send any drafts to me, or want to do a Zoom call and chat out some of the ideas, I would just be honored to be able to help you as you go, to lend support as you go through your PhD program, because we know how difficult it is to get through any schooling, not just a PhD or a master's degree, but even undergraduate with our communities, not necessarily having the long history of our support, right? But I was wondering, Audrey, also if you could say a little bit more about the archive and the possibility of perhaps how do we help, how do we support, what can the Joteria do to maybe have an electronic version of an archive for people like the people that you were mentioning that are, that are not sure about, to send it to an institution that is racist and homophobic and transphobic and just fucked up.
Yeah, thank you, Rita, so much. I miss you, and I'm missing you in person. I think I'm trying to work and sort of like convince. I think one of the persons is on board, but I'm trying to convince the other person to sort of build a digital archive. So something I forgot to mention was that I was trained by Dr. Maria Cotera. And so she, along with Dr. Linda Garcia Merchant, created Chicana por mi raza. So that's kind of like, so that was like my training and sort of like idea. Also that gave me kind of like, okay, yeah, I can digitize these stuff, like, sure. Because I did that for them, for Ana Nieto Gomez's work. And so I'm trying to work on in following that model to sort of create like something similar to that extent. I just need more, I just need time because it's a lot. So I don't think I'm like, not all of it's going to make it into the dissertation because I need to sort of like cut it and get a job and move on with my life in that sense. So I think that's going to be something like an ongoing project that will be after the dissertation. But that's sort of like the goal is to, create the infrastructure. I need a queer computer tech person that can help me sort of do that. But yeah, thank you.
Gracias for the question. Anybody else ready to ask a question? please feel free to share resources or even your own social media handles if you're interested in staying connected with this work. Wanda says she needs somebody too. Her computer skills are from the 90s. Where are these queer digital experts? We need them. I know my partner is getting trained in some, but she's also looking for one or many. We need the collectives to come forward. Audrey, one question that I had was, I think earlier the question referred to, or the comment before Rita's referred to it or kind of nodded towards it, the trauma of the archival work of this kind of research. And I often say that, those of us who teach like racism, sexism, homophobia, et cetera, it could be depressing work. And traumatizing work. And you even said you don't know if you could have continued doing the work. And yet it's so important to tell these stories and to, like our colega Eddie Alvarez talks about, like the, what is his concept, the sequence in the rubble, right? I was blanking. I was like, glitter sequence. It's both glitter and sequence. Yes, it's in there. And I'm lucky enough to be in there as well. Thank you, Rita. But I wonder, if you could share more about your own commitment to personal healing through doing this work. I know I have one of my students who asked me recently, like they're getting ready to do some oral histories with people who are going through a lot of pain and mujeres in their community. And they're asking, like, is there anybody who's done research methodologies that speak specifically to healing practice engaged in research process? So I wonder if you have any suggestions, and if you don't, maybe others might have ones that you want to share.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for me, also part of like deciding to publish this piece in that anthology was also sort of like, kind of like closing that chapter, I guess, of like my research. So not to say that I won't revisit it in the future, I don't know. But for me, at least, that kind of, I felt like that was like making peace with that, like that it wasn't just gonna stay like, I don't know, published on like ProQuest or whatever. And so that was kind of, I guess, like a way that I made sort of peace with that. And for that piece, I actually didn't really interview people, and I didn't interview people because I felt like it was like too soon and everybody's still like processing it, including myself. But I have spoken to some of like Soraida's like close friends, like, about the piece, and I sent them like a book and stuff like that, so I have those conversations of people who are much closer to her than I was. And sort of, like we have like small kind of like conversations about it. And, like every time it's like her anniversary, like we sort of like celebrate that, in one way or another. Sometimes it's just through a text, right now with like COVID, it's like, sort of like sending each other like a message of just, like remembrance. But I don't think I have like very good advice, because I think the people who I've interviewed, their stories haven't, not that they haven't been traumatic, but I think even just like the process of like talking about kind of like, speaking with someone and they're like just sharing like their coming out experience, and kind of like I share my experience, I think that's also is helpful in the sense of kind of like making sense of like, our experiences in our communities. And I mean, after I do like an oral history or interview someone, I usually treat myself to something. So that may be like a dinner, something just like that, to just kind of like, okay, I did this because it's a lot of energy, and just kind of like, like give myself time. And also like sometimes like people do cry in their interviews, and I also feel like really like responsible for that, because I know it's triggering things for them that maybe, that they weren't thinking of talking about. And so I offer people like money, you know, like for their interviews and thank them for their time, you know. And I just try to always kind of like, if I do something or, you know, something that's related to that, I always kind of like let them know like, hey, this is happening. So it's not super like, I don't have like super like these are my steps, but that's kind of sort of how I've managed it. And so in a way to be reciprocal and kind of like, you know, honor people's times and their stories. And also like just to add, that also adds a lot of responsibility because I don't want to like mess it up, you know, I don't want to get something wrong, you know, or just like misrepresent someone, which could also be a little bit, you know, creates anxiety and can kind of like, you know, stop the process of writing. So I don't know, I just like try to keep in communication with folks and kind of like share what I've done to sort of, I guess also let them see some of like, you know, this is what came out of it.
Absolutely. Those are all really useful, whether or not you were conscious or not about it. Those are wonderful strategies. Thank you for that. Does anybody else want to share any strategies?
I will, because I recorded one, I want to say within the last month or so. It's honestly, I think you have to be honest with yourself that you may also, it's kind of weird, I want to say, just like sharing this like sort of traumatic moment with them. Then you also have to be aware that they may not want to talk about things, and that's okay. And you just have to build that relationship with them. For them, it's trust mostly that they're basing this on. But I would say other than that, just be prepared. Interviews don't go as planned. But I think overall it's a great experience and it's positive.
Thank you for that, Megan. I appreciate it. Yeah, I think the only thing that I'll share also is just the creating the longer term relationships. I think, you know, from my projects, like I become part of the community and I, you know, create deep family relationships with the people who I've done research with, which isn't possible for everybody, but that's been one of my strategies. Rita, were you going to share something?
I was wondering if you could repeat the question actually, because I think I might be getting it wrong.
I think I was just being reflective of the trauma that people experience both as researcher and, you know, the research participants or collaborators. And I was wondering if Audrey had any advice for how she took care of herself or was intentional in that process.
The one thing I wanted to share that when I have participated in something similar is using water for healing, and in terms of even a shower, if you consider the shower where the water is coming up on the top of your head, and doing meditation or a prayer as the water is coming all over your body, down all over your body. So the idea is to be able to offer your sentimientos, right? Any feelings, any emotions that you might be having that are difficult to get through. And allow the water to drain it off into the drain, right? And to leave it, to let it go. That's been one of the things that I have practiced that has worked well. Como una limpia, literally you're showering yourself, but it's also conscientiously asking the water to take away that painful feeling that you're having, or that sorrow, the mourning, you know, anything else that might be in your heart, in your soul, in your spirit.
That's powerful, Rita. Thank you. I also think it's important to cry with people, right? Because sometimes, you know, like we stop ourselves from crying, we start apologizing, but I have come to realize that the tears are also a limpia, right? And sometimes it's a shared limpia, collective or partner limpia. So we are at our time. And I want to honor everybody's beautiful evening. I'll read our last comment. Wanda says, I love reading Horacio Roque Ramirez's work on community oral histories and the personal toll to help prepare for the work ahead, along with Maria Lugones's notion of faithful witnessing is very helpful in clarifying the role and position we can take in working with others. Gracias, Wanda. We'll definitely look those up and share them with our students and ourselves. I want to just thank my colega amigo Rafa. I want to thank my colega amiga Audrey. I want to thank all of you who have been on this journey with us. And I want to also thank Audrey's family, her community, all her queer tours, all her queer community, her trans and queer ancestors, everybody who has treated her with love and kindness and help restore her spirit, because her fierceness and her passion comes through in her work, and her brilliance is guiding us and regenerating us. And it's a beautiful thing to witness. Thank you for being our friend, our colleague, and sharing your beautiful work. Gracias. Rafa, do you want to say anything?
Just gracias. And so grateful to see everybody here today, and so grateful that many of you, after a long day, came and joined Audrey to support her and to continue to move her work. So I know that we put down a lot of links in the chat, so feel free to download those essays, share them, assign them in your class, assign the Instagram pages to your class as well. Let's keep moving this work forward, and let's continue archiving our Joto Historia. Gracias.
And now we have to take a picture, so please stay with us for a photo. So I'm doing a spotlight photo, and then I'm going to do a gallery photo. So no chat messages just yet. 1, 2, 3. Okay, one more. I want to take one with just Rafa and Audrey, because they're a beautiful cohort, family and friends from UCLA. 1, 2, 3. And then gallery. Thank you, everybody. Please turn your camera on if you're willing and able. 1, 2, 3. Gracias. I hope you have a fabulous evening and a fabulous weekend.
Anita, can we do the gallery view again? I think people were barely turning on their camera.
Ándale, one more. 1, 2, 3. Thank you. Thank you, Carla, for turning it on. Hi to your little one. Thank you, everybody from Cal State LA and beyond who joined us. Cuídense.
Gracias,
Bye-bye.
students. Take care. Bye-bye.
Sending you all good healing energies.